Story time about how my parents tried to sell me to a man who wanted to marry me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. When I was born, my family had a lot of money, but my dad was into some sketchy business. When I turned 17, my parents basically lost all of their money. My dad was in debt and owed money to a lot of bad people. He owed one man $100,000. When I turned 16, I got my first boyfriend. He was really caring and our families were friends. My parents actually loved my boyfriend at the time. But when I turned 17, my parents asked me if I was okay with an arranged marriage. I told them absolutely not because I had every intention to marry my boyfriend. He and I had already agreed that we'd get married when we turned 18. Slowly, my dad started insisting that I needed to consider it. After I kept saying no, he finally decided to tell me the truth. He told me that we owed one guy $100,000 and the only way that he would let my dad off the hook was by marrying me. He even offered my parents money in exchange for my hand in marriage. I found out about the truth that my dad owed $100,000. He basically told me that the only way we were going to save our family was if I married this man, and that he offered my dad money in exchange for me. I mean, I was actually scared for my life because this man was known to everybody for being dangerous. I couldn't believe my mom was going along with it, but she said it was the only way that we weren't going to get our house taken away. They basically told me not to worry because I could always get a divorce from him. But of course I didn't want to marry him at all. That very night I snuck out of my house and went to my boyfriend's house. I told him everything my parents said and he was shocked. After discussing it for a few hours, we actually decided to run away. I knew I had to go back to my house, but when I looked at my phone I had 10 missed calls from my parents. When I got home, they were waiting for me at the gate. And guess what? The strange man was there. My parents casually introduced me to this man. And when I looked at him, he was about 20 years older than me. He looked me up and down and handed my dad a check. This is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. The man looked me up and down and just stared at me. He handed my dad a check. That's when I yelled out that I was gonna go pack my stuff. Quickly packed a bag and escaped through my window. Luckily, my room was on the first floor. I ran for a few blocks where my boyfriend was in his car. Once I got in, we turned off our phones and drove an hour away. Then he told me he had a surprise for me. We got to this strange house and he told me to get out. When we went inside, there was a woman waiting for us. That's when he got down on one knee and gave me a ring. He told me that he would marry me in order to save my life. Everything happened so fast and we got married. When I turned on my phone, I had 100 missed calls from my parents. I told them what happened and they begged me to come back home. We got there, the strange man was there waiting for me. My now husband and I tell him to leave me alone. Thankfully, he ended up leaving. A few months later, my parents were debt-free. My mom sold all her jewelry and my dad sold his cars and a few other things. They should have done that from the beginning instead of trying to sell me. It's been 2 years since all that happened and I'm still married. The strange man has tried to contact me through Instagram. He offered me money once again to marry him. I told my parents and they think we should get a restraining order. What do you guys think we should do? Story time about how my lying, cheating husband moved his mistress into our home. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My husband is a classic narcissist. He's a total love bomber, lies, and gaslights. We met through some friends at a party and the day that we met, he totally love bombed me. He told me I was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, that he wanted to marry me, and that we should have kids. Unfortunately, I believed everything he said. On our second day, he told me that he loved me. And when I didn't tell him that I loved him back, he got really upset and told me that we shouldn't see each other anymore. A few weeks passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about him, so I reached out. Worst mistake of my life. At the time, I didn't realize how wealthy he was. But boy, did he start letting me know. He would flaunt that he was super rich and even invited me on a trip, which he paid for. We ended up going to the Bahamas and it was magical. Of course, I started falling in love with him. The last day of the trip, he actually asked me to marry him and I said yes. My whole family thought it was absolutely crazy of me because I only knew him for about 2 weeks. When we got back home, I moved into his beautiful house. You see, I was in a really bad situation. I had a part-time job, no savings, and basically no future. At least that's what he said. So when I moved in, he insisted that I quit my job and basically tend to the house, which I did. So I had no money of my own. This was around the time that he would start gaslighting me. Whenever we got into fights, he would call me names and just threaten me. And when I would bring it up later on, he would totally deny that he ever said anything like that. When we started planning the wedding, things calmed down. He was always at work and I was always at home. We finally got married and went on our honeymoon to Italy. And that's when he started changing even more. He would shame me whenever I tried to post a cute picture of myself on Instagram. And he basically convinced me that I was trying to get attention from other guys, so I stopped posting. Our third night in Italy, he got drunk and we got into a really big fight. I decided to leave the hotel, but when I came back a few hours later, he had a random girl in his room and told me to leave. I couldn't believe his behavior. After about 20 minutes, he let me back into the room and told the girl to leave. That's when I told him I was gonna go back home and that I made a huge mistake by marrying him. He apologized and started crying. He said nothing happened to her and part of me just wanted to believe him so desperately, so I did. When we got back home, he was on his best behavior. Until one day he told me he wanted to hire a live-in cleaning lady. Little did I know it was his mistress. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my husband moved his mistress into our home. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My narcissist of a husband told me he wanted to hire a cleaning lady. A live-in cleaning lady. A few days later, he shows up with this woman who clearly did not look like a cleaning lady. When I told him I did not want her living in our home, he told me that I had to do what he said because he was the breadwinner. Mind you, he told me to quit my job, so I did. That's when he told me that somebody needed to clean the house, cook for him, and basically take care of him. In other words, I wasn't doing that, which isn't true because I made him dinners every single day and cleaned the entire house. I told him I knew she wasn't a cleaning lady and that he needed to kick her out. He got really angry and slammed the door. A few minutes later, I hear him coming up the stairs with her. He shows her to the guest room and tells her to settle in. Then he came back into the room, told me that I had to deal with it and that this is how things were gonna be from now on. By the way, this girl is Russian, and my husband told me that she did not speak English. So basically, I had no way to communicate with her. But my husband did speak Russian, isn't that convenient? So, every single day, this girl would pretend to wash dishes, pretend to clean his clothes, pretend to make the bed. Oh yeah, and she would only wash his dishes, not mine. The situation was way too much for me, so I told my husband I was gonna go stay with my sister. That's when he threatened me and told me that if I left, I might not be able to come back. So of course, I packed my things and went straight to my sister's house. The very next day, my husband shows up to my sister's house with divorce papers. He told me I needed to sign them because he fell in love with the cleaning lady. I told him I wouldn't sign them and he left. Then my sister called the police and told them that my husband had a woman captive in his house and that she was probably in the country illegally. And guess what, y'all? She was. The cops actually took her from the house and now he's asking me to move back in. He took the whole divorce back and wants to take me on a trip. My sister thinks I should get back with him just to make his life miserable. The problem is I have no money of my own. And to be honest, part of me still loves him. I really need some advice and perspective from someone who's not me.
Storytime about how I found my mother's stalker living underneath her bed. My mother and father divorced shortly after I was born. My mom has raised me all on her own, so her and I are extremely close. I would do anything for my mother. Back in the 90s, my mom became a somewhat successful model. She did runway shows and campaign ads. She began dating a photographer when I was about 8 years old, but something about him just rubbed me the wrong way. He was very controlling of my mother and always wanted to know where she was. This was a time before cell phones, and everywhere she would go, he would always end up being there. A few months into the relationship, my mother decided to break up with him. He threatened her and told her that he would make her regret it. He began calling our house at midnight, throwing rocks at my mom's window. One morning, my mom woke up to a knife in her tire. He really was trying to make her regret it. This is when my mom realized that we needed to move away and get away from him. We moved to Atlanta and my mom began getting more modeling work. She started earning more and we moved into a big, beautiful house. It had 2 floors, a basement, and a huge garden. We loved the house. Soon after we moved in, I started noticing some weird things. Sometimes windows would be wide open when I got home from school, as well as random items in the garden. I came home from school one day and went to my mom's room. That's when I found a man's boot underneath her bed and her window wide open. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how I found my mother's stalker living underneath her bed. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it was sent to me on Instagram. After I found the boot under my mom's bed and her window wide open, I told her. My mom began to cry and was really scared. By the way, I was 12 at this time. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it was sent to me on Instagram. My mom went around the house locking all the windows and doors. She told me if I ever saw anything like that again to call the cops. I could tell she was really scared and this terrified me. Every day after school, I would go straight to my mom's room and check underneath her bed. And weirdly enough, I started finding random items. One day, I found a pocket watch. A few days later, I found a handkerchief. And that continued for about a month. Mom and I decided to call the cops and give them all the items that we'd found. The cops told my mom there was nothing they could do because there was no physical harm done to her or me. Later that night, I wake up to my mom screaming. The house was dark and I ran down the hallway. Suddenly, a dark figure walks out of my mom's room. The black figure looked at me and walked away. I was frozen and couldn't move. The cops asked my mom what the man did. She said that when she woke up, she saw him standing in the corner of the room dressed in black with a black mask, and that all he did was stare at her. When she asked him what he wanted, he told her you. The cops tried to convince my mom that it was probably a robbery. She told them about her ex and they said it was probably nothing and to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from school and check underneath my mom's bed. There I found a handwritten note. You'll never guess what it said. It was terrifying. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how I found my mother's stalker living underneath her bed. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. Under my mom's bed, I found a handwritten note from her stalker. I couldn't bring myself to read it. I gave it to my mom and she read it. She cried and told me to pack a bag. That night, we went to sleep at a hotel and the cops came to check our house. The cops said they found nothing in the house and it was safe for us to come back. 2 days later, I decided to come home from school early, but I knew that my mom wouldn't be home and I would be all alone. When I walked up to the house, I noticed my mom's bedroom window was open. I walked slowly up the stairs and swung the door open, and that's when I saw a man's foot sticking out from underneath my mom's bed. When he heard me open the door, he pulled his foot in. I screamed so loud and closed the door behind me and started running down the stairs. That's when I heard him open the door. I could hear his footsteps behind me as I ran down the stairs. As he ran down the stairs, he tripped and fell. I could hear him yelling in pain. I ran straight to the neighbor's house. She already knew about the break-in and believed me right away. She called the cops and my mother. Her husband decided to go check the house, but when he came back, he said there was nothing there. When I told him that he fell down the stairs, the cops thought he might be in the hospital if he injured himself. And there they found a man dressed in black. That's when the man told the cops that he was my mother's boyfriend and that he came to visit us. They thankfully arrested him. When they showed my mom the man's mugshot, she recognized him right away as her ex. Turns out he had been breaking into our house for over a month, and he would sleep there every night underneath my mom. He was in prison for 10 years but got out last year. My mother and I live in fear.